The man they would later call a miracle arrived at St. Jude's Metropolitan Hospital like a piece of driftwood, washed ashore by a tide of urban chaos. He was found wandering a few blocks away, his gaze distant, his clothes, simple gray trousers and a worn blue shirt, offering no clues. He carried no wallet, no phone, no keys. He had no name, or at least not one he could recall. The blank space where his identity should have been was a hollow ache behind his eyes, a silent, echoing void. In the triage bay, a nurse with tired eyes and a practiced, gentle voice asked him the standard questions. He could not answer his date of birth, his address, or even if he was allergic to anything. The chasm in his mind was absolute, but his demeanor was unnervingly calm. Amidst the symphony of suffering that was the Monday night ER, the wails of a child with a broken arm, the guttural moans of a man clutching his chest, the frantic staccato beeping of a dozen monitors, he was an island of stillness. He sat on the edge of a gurney in the hallway, his posture perfect, his hands resting on his knees. His eyes, a startlingly clear shade of blue, did not hold the panicked confusion of a typical amnesiac. Instead, they scanned the environment with a methodical, analytical precision. He tracked the movements of the nurses, the trajectory of the crash carts, the efficient, brutal ballet of emergency medicine. He saw it all not as a frightened patient, but as if he were a general observing a familiar battlefield. "Do you remember anything at all?" The nurse, a young man named Ben, asked, his pen hovering over the John Doe intake form. "A job? A family?" The man closed his eyes. He searched the impenetrable fog. Nothing, no faces, no names. But then a flicker. Not a memory, but a feeling. The sensation of a perfectly weighted tool in his hand. The cool, dry snap of a latex glove. The intense, focused quiet of a room where the only sound was a ventilator and the rhythmic beat of a heart on a screen. The words came to his lips before he even thought them. A whisper from a life he could not access. "I'm a surgeon." Ben paused, his pen stopping midair. He looked at the man. The claim was so specific, so at odds with his current state. He wrote it down with a small, skeptical question mark beside it. The king of this chaotic kingdom was Dr. Alan Vance. To the hospital board, he was a godsend. Brilliant, efficient, with malpractice insurance premiums as low as his patient turnover was high. To the residents and nurses, he was a tempest. Vance was a man whose ego was a tangible force, filling every room he entered like a change in atmospheric pressure. He was handsome in a severe, angular way, his movements sharp and impatient, as if the world was perpetually moving too slowly for his magnificent intellect. He strode through the ER, his white coat billowing behind him like a royal cape, barking orders that were less suggestions and more divine pronouncements. He overheard Ben talking to another nurse about the new John Doe. "Says he's a surgeon," Ben said, a hint of wonder in his voice. Vance let out a short, derisive laugh that cut through the noise of the ER like a shard of glass. "A surgeon? Really? And I'm the King of England. What's his actual diagnosis? Acute psychosis? Did you run a talk screen? He's probably high on something you can't even pronounce." He approached the gurney where the man sat. He didn't address him directly, instead speaking to Ben as if the man were an inanimate object, a piece of medical curiosity. "So, this is our master of the scalpel?" Vance's voice dripped with a thick, syrupy sarcasm. He circled the gurney, his eyes raking over the man's simple clothes, the scuff marks on his shoes. "Doesn't look like any surgeon I know. Where's your Rolex? Your tailored Italian suit? Did you leave your Porsche with the valet?" The man on the gurney finally looked up, his calm blue eyes meeting Vance's mocking gaze. He said nothing. He simply watched, his expression unreadable, his stillness a stone wall against which Vance's arrogance crashed and broke. The lack of a reaction, the absence of the fear or deference Vance expected, was like a lit match to his temper. "Cat got your tongue, boy," Vance sneered, leaning in close. "Or did you forget how to talk along with everything else? We'll find a nice quiet room for you in the psych ward. They have plenty of surgeons there, and astronauts, and Napoleon Bonaparte. You'll be in good company." He turned his back, dismissing the man with a flick of his hand. "Get him processed and out of my ER. I have actual lives to save." The sterile authority of the emergency room was a character in itself. It was a place built of hard surfaces and harder decisions, smelling of bleach, latex, and the faint metallic tang of blood. The fluorescent lights hummed a constant, monotonous drone, casting a harsh, unforgiving glare on every surface, stripping away all softness and shadow. It was a world of controlled hysteria, where life and death were measured in seconds, in the precise titration of a drip, in the split-second interpretation of a jagged line on a monitor. For Dr. Vance, this was his theater, and every life-or-death scenario was another scene in which he was the star. He moved through the chaos with a predator's grace, his confidence and armor against the desperation that clung to the air like a sickness. The stillness of the evening was shattered by a sound that made every head in the ER turn. It was not a single siren, but a chorus, a rising, screaming crescendo of multiple ambulances converging on their location. The radio crackled to life with the clipped, urgent voice of a paramedic. "Multiple vehicle pile-up on the interstate. We're inbound with 3 criticals, ETA 2 minutes. Get ready." Vance's eyes lit up. This was his element. The bigger the disaster, the brighter his star shone. "All right, people, let's move," he bellowed, his voice transforming the weary staff into a well-oiled machine. "Trauma, bays 1, 2, and 3. Let's clear the decks. I want full trauma teams ready and waiting. Now." The first 2 patients were a brutal testament to the physics of twisted metal. Broken bones, internal bleeding, the standard, gruesome fare of a high-speed collision. Vance directed their care with an almost bored efficiency, his mind already on the third, the one the paramedics had called the most critical. When the gurney burst through the doors, a collective gasp went through the room. On it was a small child, a girl no older than 10, her face pale as marble beneath an oxygen mask. A piece of jagged metal, a shard from a car's frame, was embedded in the side of her head, just behind her ear. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow, her life hanging by the thinnest of threads. "Get her to CT, now," Vance commanded. He followed the team, his face a mask of intense concentration. The girl's parents were right behind, their faces etched with a terror so profound it seemed to suck the air from the hallway. The John Doe, still waiting on his gurney in the corridor, watched the small tragic procession go by. His eyes fixed on the metallic shard, on its angle, its depth. An involuntary tremor went through his hands. He flexed his fingers, a strange and powerful muscle memory stirring in the depths of his amnesia. He felt an overwhelming, instinctual urge to follow, a pull as undeniable as gravity. Minutes later, the CT scans illuminated the monitor in the trauma bay. They were a physician's worst nightmare. The image was stark, brutal, and unequivocal. The metal fragment was lodged deep within the temporal lobe, its jagged tip resting perilously against the brainstem, nestled amongst the delicate latticework of the pontine arteries. To move, it was to risk a catastrophic, unsurvivable hemorrhage. To leave it was to guarantee death from swelling and pressure. It was, in medical terms, a checkmate. Vance stared at the screen, his jaw tight. He was a superb ER doctor, a master of the golden hour, but this was neurosurgery of a complexity that belonged in a specialized, futuristic institute, not a city hospital ER. He had to make the call. He turned to the parents, his face softening into a practiced mask of somber authority, the look of a god regretfully delivering a verdict. "I'm so sorry," he began, the words heavy and final. "The location of the fragment. It's inoperable. It's resting against the brainstem. Any attempt to remove it would... There is no survivable way to perform that surgery. All we can do now is make her comfortable." The mother's legs gave out and she collapsed into her husband's arms, a raw, animal sob tearing from her throat. The hope in the room evaporated, replaced by the cold, heavy finality of death. The nurses and residents looked down, their faces grim, avoiding the parents' shattered eyes. It was into this thick silence of despair that a quiet voice spoke, firm and clear. "You're wrong." Every head turned. The John Doe stood in the doorway of the trauma bay. He had slipped off his gurney, drawn by the invisible thread of his past life. His gaze was not on the people, but locked onto the CT scan on the monitor. His face was a study in absolute focus, the blankness of his amnesia replaced by a startling, brilliant clarity. "There's a way," he said, taking a step into the room. His hands began to move in the air, sketching invisible lines, his fingers tracing pathways that only he could see. "A trans-temporal suboccipital approach. You need to perform a limited craniotomy, well posterior to the injury. You retract the cerebellum, not the temporal lobe. That gives you a window, a corridor. You can approach the fragment from behind, from underneath. You can dissect it away from the pontine arteries without tearing them. It's delicate, but it's possible." For a moment there was stunned silence. The technical precision of the language, the sheer audacity of the claim, held everyone captive. Then Vance's face, which had been pale with grim duty, flooded with a deep, furious red. The sanctity of his domain had been violated by the one person he had already dismissed as less than nothing. He turned on the man, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Who in the hell do you think you are?" Then he laughed. It was not a sound of humor. It was a loud, barking, cruel noise designed to humiliate, to shatter, to destroy. It echoed in the trauma bay, a sacrilege in the face of the dying child and her grieving parents. Several of the younger staff, conditioned to follow Vance's lead, snickered nervously. "Our surgeon has a medical opinion," Vance bellowed, his voice dripping with venomous sarcasm. He jabbed a finger at the man. "You, the delusional amnesiac from the street. You think you can waltz in here and tell me how to do my job? You think you're smarter than that CT scan? You are a patient, a nobody, a piece of psych ward fodder." He strode towards the man until they were inches apart. "Let me be clear, B. Boy," he spat the word like a poisoned dart. "You are in my emergency room. That little girl is my patient, and I say she is dying. Your half-baked, insane ramblings are not helping. You are actively causing distress to a grieving family. You are a disruption. You are a threat." He turned to the two large orderlies who had followed the man into the room. "Get him out of here, now." The John Doe did not move. He did not flinch. His serene, blue eyes remained locked on Vance, not with anger, but with a look of profound, devastating pity. It was the look of a master craftsman watching a clumsy apprentice about to break something irreplaceable. "You are letting your pride kill a child," the man said, his voice still quiet, yet it carried across the room like a thunderclap. That was the final straw. Vance's face contorted into a mask of pure rage. "That's it!" he screamed, his professional composure shattering completely. "He's psychotic and he's a danger to my patients. I want him sedated. Now, 100 milligrams of ketamine, and put him in 4-point restraints until psych can take him away." The orderlies grabbed the man's arms. He didn't fight back. He allowed them to lead him away. His last glance not at the furious doctor, but at the heartbroken parents. A look of shared sorrow on his face. The door to a side room swung shut behind him, and Dr. Vance, breathing heavily, turned back to his audience, his authority reasserted through sheer volume and brutality. The hope the quiet man had briefly ignited was extinguished, crushed under the heel of an arrogant man's pride. The two orderlies, burly men accustomed to dealing with violent psychotics and belligerent drunks, were taken aback by the John Doe's compliance. He walked between them without resistance, his steps measured and calm. They led him to a small, windowless observation room, a place of padded walls and quiet desperation. As they guided him to the bed, his placid acceptance seemed to unnerve them more than any struggle would have. It was the calm of a man who was not being subdued, but was merely allowing events to unfold as they must. "I'm ordering you to sedate him." Vance's voice, shrill and furious, echoed from the trauma bay. He stormed into the observation room behind them, a syringe in his hand. The sight of Vance, the chief of the ER, personally preparing to administer a sedative was a shocking breach of protocol, a testament to how deeply the quiet man had unsettled him. The John Doe looked at the needle, then back at Vance. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice a simple statement of fact. This utter lack of fear, this refusal to be intimidated, was the ultimate insult to Vance's authority. It was a silent declaration that Vance held no real power over him. "The only mistake was letting a vagrant like you wander my ER," Vance snarled, and plunged the needle into the man's arm, pushing the plunger with a vicious finality. "Put him in the restraints. I want him secured until he's transferred." The orderlies strapped his wrists and ankles to the corners of the bed. The John Doe did not fight. He simply lay back, his eyes closing as the powerful dissociative anesthetic began its work. Vance stood over him for a moment, his chest heaving, a triumphant sneer on his face. He had won. He had silenced the voice that questioned him. He turned and strode out of the room, slamming the door behind him, leaving the man alone in the enforced twilight. But not everyone had been cowed by Dr. Vance's tirade. Nurse Maria Flores, a woman in her late 50s with silver-streaked hair and eyes that had seen 30 years of life and death pass through these same doors, had watched the entire exchange with a growing sense of disquiet. She had been a nurse since before Vance was in medical school. She knew the look of a psychotic, the disjointed speech, the panicked eyes. This man had none of that. His words about the surgical procedure were not the ramblings of a madman. They were structured, precise, and spoken with an unshakable confidence that felt like knowledge, not delusion. More than that, she had seen his hands. When he described the procedure, his fingers had moved with an unconscious, fluid grace. It was the ghost of a muscle memory so ingrained it had survived the death of his conscious mind. It was the phantom dance of a master surgeon. Mariah had also been the one to process his meager belongings when he first arrived. Tucked into his sock was a small, folded piece of paper, a receipt from a coffee shop. On the back, he had unconsciously scribbled 2 words over and over, as if trying to grasp a fading dream. Project Chimera. And there was something else. While an orderly had been taking his vitals, his sleeve had ridden up, revealing a small, peculiar tattoo on the inside of his wrist. It was a stylized caduceus, the symbol of medicine, but instead of a staff, the 2 snakes were coiled around a wickedly sharp dagger. The image was stark, military, and utterly unique. It had stuck in her mind. Now, standing in the hallway, listening to the renewed, hopeless sobs of the little girl's mother, Maria felt a cold certainty settle in her gut. Vance was wrong. Pride and ego were about to let a child die, and that quiet, restrained man in the observation room might be her only chance. It was a terrible, career-ending risk. But the alternative, to do nothing, was a moral failure she could not accept. Her heart pounding, she slipped away from the hubbub around the trauma bay and into a small, cluttered supply closet. The air smelled of iodine and cardboard. She pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling so badly she could barely type. She first typed the words from the scrap of paper into the search bar. Project Chimera Surgeon. The results were sparse and heavily redacted. Most were classified military documents, but a few articles from defense journals hinted at a revolutionary, almost mythical, battlefield neurosurgery program. A program so advanced, so radical, it was spoken of in whispers. It was designed for saving soldiers with inoperable head wounds right on the front lines. The program had been spearheaded by a single, anonymous surgeon, a figure of legend known only by his call sign. Maria's breath caught in her throat. She tried a new search describing the tattoo. Surgeon Dagger Caduceus Tattoo Military. This time, she got a hit. A grainy photo from a military blog post about medical insignias. There it was, the dagger and the snakes. The caption below it read, "Unofficial insignia of the director of Project Chimera, the surgeon known only as Sparrow, a symbol of medicine practiced at the tip of the spear." Her blood ran cold. Sparrow, a legend, and he was lying sedated and restrained 20 feet away. The article mentioned a fail-safe, a protocol for a situation just like this. It listed a single, unclassified phone number, designated for the Continuity of Medical Command Protocol, a number to be used only in the gravest of emergencies concerning high-level medical personnel. Taking a deep, ragged breath, knowing she was about to either save a life or destroy her own, Maria dialed the number. In the padded room, the ketamine did not bring the oblivion Vance had intended. Instead of darkness, it threw open a door in the John Doe's mind, not to memory but to a torrent of raw, disconnected sensation. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of light and sound. He felt the violent, jarring vibration of a helicopter floor, the rhythmic whump, whump, whump of rotor blades beating the air was a physical presence, a pulse in his bones. The air tasted of red dust and cordite. He smelled sweat, blood, and the hot metal of a gun barrel. He saw faces, young, terrified, covered in grime and blood. Soldiers. His soldiers. A voice, loud and urgent over a radio, crackled in his mind. "Sparrow, we have a critical head wound. Command says he's a lost cause, but we're bringing him to you." Sparrow. The name resonated through him, not as his own, but as a title, a function, a sacred duty. He felt the weight of a scalpel in his gloved hand. It felt like an extension of his own body. He was in a tent, the light dim, the pressure immense. A general, a man with stars on his collar and a face like carved granite, was staring at him. "Can you save him, son?" He didn't have a name for the general, but he felt a wave of love and respect for him. A father, his father. The image of the little girl's CT scan from the ER monitor superimposed itself over the memory of the soldier's wound. The two images merged. The same impossible injury. The same death sentence delivered by lesser men. He felt a surge of cold, calm fury. Not rage, but the icy resolve of a man whose entire existence was dedicated to defying the impossible. His hands, though strapped to the bed, twitched. His fingers moved in infinitesimally small motions, practicing the surgery. Transtemporal, suboccipital. The words were an incantation, a map. He ran the procedure in his mind, step by painstaking step. He saw the bone flap being lifted. He saw the gentle retraction of the cerebellum, the glistening surface of the brain. He saw the fragment, dark and ugly, nestled against the shimmering arteries of the brainstem. He saw his instruments, extensions of his will, moving with impossible delicacy, teasing the metal away from the tissue, millimeter by millimeter. He fought the sedative, not with his body, but with his mind. He clung to the surgical plan, using it as an anchor in the chemical storm. The chaos of the drug-induced state began to recede, replaced by the crystalline, hyper-focused world of the operating theater. He was not a John Doe. He was not a vagrant. He was Sparrow, and he had a job to do. Thousands of miles away, in a secure, soundproofed office deep within the Pentagon, a phone rang. It was a phone that rarely rang, a simple black device on a polished mahogany desk. General Marcus Thorne, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a man whose orders could move armies and shift the geopolitical landscape, looked at it with surprise. It was the CMCP line, a line that had not been used in 3 years. He picked it up, his voice a low rumble of authority. "Thorne." On the other end, he heard the frantic, trembling voice of a woman. "My name is Maria Flores. I'm a nurse at St. Jude's Metropolitan Hospital. There's a man here, a John Doe. He has a tattoo, a dagger, and snakes. He said something about Project Chimera." The general's entire body went rigid. The papers in his hand fell forgotten to the desk. His knuckles, gripping the receiver, turned white. The air in the room seemed to crystallize. "Describe the man," he commanded, his voice suddenly sharp and cold as ice. Maria quickly recounted the story, the amnesia, the claim of being a surgeon, the incident with the little girl, the inoperable diagnosis, and Dr. Vance's furious reaction. She told him about the sedation and the restraints. With every word, the storm in General Thorne's eyes grew darker. When she finished, he asked one final, critical question, his voice dangerously quiet. "Did he offer a surgical solution?" "Yes," Maria whispered. "He called it a transtemporal sub-occipital approach. A muscle feathered in Thorne's jaw. It was Sparrow's signature, the crown jewel of Project Chimera." "Keep him there." Thorne's voice was no longer quiet. It was the voice of absolute command, a force of nature about to be unleashed. "Do not let anyone move him. Do not let that doctor touch him or the child. I am inbound. I am coming myself." He slammed the phone down. He hit an intercom button on his desk, his voice a thunderous roar that shook his aide in the next room. "Get me a Blackhawk on the roof. Now. Scrambles F-22s for escort and clear a flight path to St. Jude's Metropolitan Hospital in downtown Chicago. I want all air traffic from here to Illinois grounded. I don't care who I have to call. Do it." He hit another button. "Mobilize the surgeon's protocol team. Full deployment, top-tier support and security. I want them at St. Jude's yesterday. Tell them—" He paused, his voice thick with a sudden, raw emotion. "Tell them Sparrow is down, and he needs us." Within seconds, the most powerful military in the world pivoted its attention to a single, unassuming city hospital. Protocols were not just bypassed, they were shattered. For the man known as Sparrow, the rules of the world were being rewritten in real time. Back in the ER at St. Jude's, a fragile, temporary peace had settled. The little girl had been moved to a private room to await the inevitable, her parents holding a silent, heartbreaking vigil. Dr. Vance, his ego salved and his authority restored, was at the central nursing station, pompously dictating his notes into a recorder, carefully choosing words that would absolve him of any doubt and frame his decision as the only compassionate, logical choice. "Patient presents with catastrophic, inoperable intracranial injury," he began, his voice smooth and self-assured. His words were cut off by a sound. It started as a low, distant hum, a vibration felt more in the bones than heard with the ears, but it grew exponentially, doubling in volume every second. The hum became a thrum, then a roar, a deafening, rhythmic whump, whump, whump that seemed to come from directly overhead. The entire building began to vibrate. In the trauma bay, instrument trays rattled. The windows shook in their frames. Nurses and doctors looked up, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm. "What in God's name is that?" someone shouted over the din. Before anyone could answer, the main ambulance bay doors, heavy automatic sliders, were thrown open with such force that they flew off their tracks and slammed into the interior walls. The roar of the helicopters was now mixed with the screech of tires as a convoy of black, unmarked SUVs screeched to a halt just outside. The ER, a place of constant motion, froze. Every doctor, every nurse, every patient with the strength to lift their head stared in stunned, silent disbelief. Through the ruined doorway marched a phalanx of figures that did not belong. They moved with a synchronized, intimidating precision that made the hospital's own frantic energy seem clumsy and amateurish. At the front were a dozen men in black tactical gear, their weapons held at a low ready, their eyes scanning every corner of the room with cold, professional detachment. Behind them came a medical team in military fatigues, carrying cases of specialized equipment that looked like something out of a science fiction film. And at the center of this storm, walking with a calm, unstoppable purpose, was General Marcus Thorne. He was in his full Class A dress uniform, the 4 silver stars on each shoulder glittering like angry constellations under the harsh fluorescent lights. His chest was a billboard of valor, covered in ribbons that spoke of a lifetime of service and command. His face was carved from granite, his eyes sweeping the room with an incinerating gaze that promised swift and terrible judgment. The silence in the ER was absolute. The only sounds were the ignored beeps of the monitors and the thunderous rhythmic crunch of General Thorne's dress shoes on the scuffed linoleum floor. His eyes scanned the room, passing over the utterly flabbergasted Dr. Vance as if he were a piece of furniture, a meaningless obstacle. Thorne's gaze was a heat-seeking missile, and it found its target in the small closed door of the observation room. He strode towards it, his entourage parting to let him through. He did not knock. He kicked the door open with a single, contemptuous motion. Inside, he saw the man on the bed, restrained. The sight caused the general's stony face to twist in a brief, agonizing spasm of fury and pain. "Get him out of those," he growled to his medics. Ignoring the orderlies who had been posted outside the door, Thorne himself stepped to the bed. With his own hands, the hands of one of the most powerful men in the country, he unbuckled the leather restraints from the man's wrists. He gently chafed the reddened skin. Then he took a step back. In the doorway, in full view of the entire emergency room staff, General Marcus Thorne snapped to attention. He brought his hand up to his brow in the sharpest, most flawless salute he had ever rendered. His voice, filled with a lifetime of respect and a father's fierce pride, echoed in the silent room. "Colonel, it is good to see you, sir." The man on the bed, the John Doe, slowly sat up. He looked at the general, then at the salute, and a flicker of recognition, of a forgotten lifetime, sparked in his tired blue eyes. Thorne dropped his salute and turned to face the ER, his body blocking the view of the man on the bed as if to protect him from their unworthy eyes. His gaze found Dr. Vance, who now looked as if he had been turned to stone. Vance's jaw was slack, his face a pasty, sickly white. The dictation recorder had slipped from his numb fingers and clattered to the floor. "I am General Marcus Thorne," he announced, his voice not loud, but carrying an authority so immense it made Vance's earlier shouting seem like the squeaking of a mouse. "And this man," he jabbed a thumb towards the room behind him, "who your doctor here is seen fit to mock, to drug, and to chain to a bed like an animal, is Colonel Dr. Elias Thorne, my son." A collective, audible gasp rippled through the staff. Vance looked as though he'd been shot. "But you," Thorne continued, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl, "you might know him by another name. On the battlefield, where men of real courage fight and die, they call him Sparrow. He is the founder, and, to this day, the sole practitioner of Project Chimera. He is, without exaggeration, the most decorated and profoundly gifted combat surgeon in the history of the United States Armed Forces." Thorne took a step towards Vance, who involuntarily shrank back. "The procedure he described to you, the one you dismissed as the ravings of a madman, is not in any of your pathetic little textbooks because he invented it. He invented it in a mud-floored tent with mortars landing 50 yards away to save a soldier that lesser men like you, had left for dead. He has performed that exact surgery, that impossible miraculous surgery, 17 times. 17. Each time a success. He has held more lives in his hands in a single afternoon than you will see in your entire pampered career." The general was now standing directly in front of the nursing station, looming over the diminished figure of Dr. Vance. "He was on his way here, on my orders, to consult on a difficult case for one of your own senior surgeons when his transport was involved in an accident, resulting in his temporary memory loss. He came to you for help, and you met him with scorn. You saw a man without a wallet, and you judged him. You saw humility, and you called it weakness. You heard genius, and you called it madness. Your ego, your pathetic, fragile ego, was more important to you than the life of a 10-year-old girl." He pointed a rigid, trembling finger at Vance. "You are not a doctor. You are a disgrace to the very oath you swore. As of this moment, you are relieved of your duties." "Military police," he barked, and 2 of the tactical officers stepped forward. will escort this man from the premises. He is not to touch another patient. A full investigation by the State Medical Board, of which I am a special consultant, will begin immediately. I assure you, you will never practice medicine in this country again." Vance opened his mouth, but only a dry, croaking sound came out. His face had collapsed, the arrogant mask stripped away to reveal the terrified, small man beneath. He looked around for support, but every single one of his colleagues, every nurse he had ever belittled, every resident he had ever humiliated, stared back at him with cold, unforgiving contempt. The MPs took him by the arms, their grip firm and impersonal, and began to lead the once mighty Dr. Vance away, his white coat, his symbol of power, now looking like a shroud. He was a king being frog-marched out of his own fallen castle, utterly and completely broken. "Prep an operating room," General Thorne's voice boomed across the now silent ER, snapping the spell of shock that had frozen everyone in place. "The colonel will operate." The command was absolute, bypassing every hospital protocol, every administrative chain of command. It was not a request, it was the new reality. The general's elite medical team sprang into action, a whirlwind of terrifying efficiency. They did not wait for the hospital staff. They directed them. "We need OR-3, their lead medic announced. "Clear it and sterilize it. We'll be using our own equipment." They unlatched their specialized cases, revealing surgical instruments of a design and material the St. Jude's surgeons had never seen before, lightweight, non-magnetic alloys, and a portable microsurgical imaging unit that made the hospital's top-of-the-line equipment look like a child's toy. Meanwhile, in the observation room, Elias Thorne was helped to his feet. The fog of the sedative was lifting, but the chasm of his amnesia remained. He did not know the general's name, but he felt an undeniable connection, a deep, instinctual trust. He didn't know his own name, but when the general had called him Colonel, it had felt right. A medic handed him a set of sterile dark blue scrubs. As Elias pulled them on, a change came over him. The simple act of donning the familiar uniform was like a key turning in a lock. The lost, vacant look in his eyes was replaced by a laser-like focus. His posture straightened. His hands, which had been resting limply at his sides, now moved with purpose. His memory was a blank slate, but his body, his very cells, remembered their calling. He was no longer John Doe, the amnesiac. He was Sparrow, the surgeon. He walked out of the observation room and towards the prepared OR. The entire ER staff parted for him like the Red Sea, their faces a mixture of awe, shame, and profound reverence. He walked past the little girl's parents, who were now staring at him, their faces filled with a fragile, terrified hope. He paused for a fraction of a second and met the mother's eyes. He gave a single, small nod. It was not a promise of success. It was a promise of effort, a promise that he would bring the sum total of his existence to bear on saving her daughter. It was enough. Inside the operating room, the atmosphere was electric. The gallery above was packed, standing room only. Every available surgeon in the hospital, from the chief of staff to the greenest intern, was there, summoned by the news that was spreading through St. Jude's like wildfire. They were about to witness a legend. Elias stepped up to the surgical table. He did not speak. He simply held out his hand. A nurse, one of his father's team, slapped a scalpel into his palm. The moment his fingers closed around the familiar weight of the steel, the transformation was complete. He was home. What followed was not surgery. It was art. It was a ballet of impossible precision and audacious grace. His hands moved in a blur, yet every motion was economical, deliberate, and perfect. He performed the suboccipital craniotomy with a speed and confidence that made the watching surgeons gasp. He retracted the cerebellum with a touch so delicate it seemed he was parting water. On the high-definition monitor in the gallery, they saw the landscape of the human brain. a place none of them had ever dared to venture, and they saw Sparrow move through it like a native. He located the metal fragment, the dark intruder against the pale, shimmering tissue. His instruments, guided by knowledge that was more instinct than memory, descended into the breach. For 2 hours, the only sounds in the OR were the quiet hum of the machines and Elias's soft, clipped commands for instruments. He dissected the shard away from the pontine arteries with a patience that was both terrifying and beautiful. Millimeter by agonizing millimeter, he teased it free, cauterizing microscopic bleeders as he went. The surgeons in the gallery watched, their own hands sweating, their hearts pounding. They were not just watching a difficult operation. They were watching the very definition of inoperable being rewritten before their eyes. Then, with a final delicate move, it was free. Elias lifted the jagged piece of metal out of the wound with a pair of forceps and dropped it into a metal basin with a sharp clink. The sound echoed in the silent room like a victory bell. The surgery was over. The girl was stabilized. Her vitals, which had been crashing, were already beginning to climb back toward normalcy. A life had been snatched back from the absolute brink of death. Elias stepped back from the table, his work done. He stripped off his gloves and mask, his face beaded with sweat but serene. He looked at his own hands, not with confusion, but with a newfound wonder, a flicker of understanding dawning in his eyes. General Thorne, who had been watching from a corner of the OR, stepped forward and placed a heavy, proud hand on his son's shoulder. "Let's go home, Elias," he said softly. The military team closed ranks around him, forming a protective cordon. They escorted him from the OR, through the still-silent ER, and out into the night, where the Black Hawk helicopter waited, its rotors already beginning to spin. He had arrived as a nameless ghost, and he left as a living legend, vanishing back into the secret world from which he came, leaving behind him a miracle and a hospital forever changed. 6 months passed. The seasons turned, but the events of that night at St. Jude's Metropolitan remained frozen in time, a legend whispered in the hospital's corridors. The fallout for Dr. Alan Vance was as swift as it was brutal. The investigation, spearheaded by a vengeful General Thorne, was merciless. It uncovered not just his actions on that single night, but a career-long pattern of hubris, of dismissing nurses' concerns, of bullying residents, and of a dangerous, godlike complex that had, the board concluded, led to at least 2 other preventable patient deaths that had been previously written off as unavoidable complications. His medical license was not suspended. It was permanently revoked. He was sued for malpractice by the family of the little girl, a lawsuit the hospital settled instantly for a staggering sum. He became a pariah in the Chicago medical community and beyond. The story of Vance's folly was too spectacular, too damning. He lost his multi-million-dollar condo, his sports cars, his friends. His name, once a symbol of brilliance and success, was now a cautionary tale, a synonym for arrogant failure. The fall from grace was not a descent, it was a plummet into a bottomless abyss. St. Jude's itself underwent a painful but necessary transformation. Under intense scrutiny from the military and the National Medical Board, the hospital was forced to implement sweeping systemic changes. The most prominent of these was the new John Doe Protocol, quickly nicknamed the Sparrow Protocol. It was a mandatory new procedure for the intake of all unidentified patients, a system built on the assumption of dignity and hidden worth. It required more extensive initial screenings, psychological consults that focused on trauma-induced amnesia rather than immediate assumptions of psychosis, and a mandatory second opinion from a senior physician on any inoperable or terminal diagnosis made in the ER. The hospital's culture, once driven by Vance's brand of arrogant efficiency, was slowly, painfully being rebuilt around a core of humility and collaboration. The young girl, whose name was Lily, had made a full and miraculous recovery. Her story was a local news sensation. a living, breathing testament to the quiet man who had appeared like an angel and vanished like a ghost. Elias Thorne spent those 6 months at a quiet, secluded military rehabilitation facility in the mountains of Colorado. Surrounded by the familiar rhythms of military life and the patient guidance of his father, his memory began to return. It came not in a flood, but in fragments, like a shattered photograph being slowly pieced back together. He remembered the dust of Afghanistan, the faces of the men he'd saved, the cold weight of a scalpel in his hand under fire. He remembered his call sign, Sparrow. And, finally, he remembered his name, Elias. The memories were haunted by the trauma that had caused his amnesia, the violent crash of his transport, but they were his. He was no longer a blank slate. He was offered a position as the head of surgical instruction at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, a chance to teach his revolutionary techniques to a new generation. He was a hero, a legend. But the man who emerged from the fog of amnesia was quieter, more introspective than the driven surgeon who had entered it. The experience had changed him, given him a perspective beyond the sterile confines of the operating room. One crisp autumn afternoon, he was sitting by a lake near the facility, skipping stones across the glassy surface when a figure approached him. The man was thin, his shoulders slumped, his face etched with a weariness that went bone deep. He wore the simple uniform of a medical supply company. It was Alan Vance. Vance had spent months falling, and then months trying to claw his way back to some semblance of a man. He'd taken the menial job stocking shelves to pay his rent on a tiny apartment. He had also spent that time tracking Elias down, not for revenge, but for something far more difficult: atonement. He stopped a few feet away, his hands twisting the brim of a baseball cap. "Colonel Thorne," he began, his voice raspy, unused to speaking with such deference. "Dr. Thorne." "Elias." Vance couldn't meet his eyes, instead staring at the ground as if it held the immense weight of his shame. There are no words. I know that. But I had to find you. I had to tell you. I'm sorry. I was arrogant. I was a fool. I was a monster. I almost killed that little girl because I couldn't stand being questioned. I was so full of myself there was no room for anything else." Elias stopped skipping stones. He turned and looked at Vance, his blue eyes as clear and calm as they had been in the ER. There was no anger in them, no triumph, only a quiet, searching intelligence. He didn't offer the easy, meaningless absolution Vance might have been hoping for. "An apology doesn't erase what you were, Dr. Vance," Elias said, his voice soft but firm. "It only marks the moment you decided to be something different. Your words don't matter to me. They don't matter to Lily, the girl you almost condemned. The only person they matter to is you." Tears welled in Vance's eyes, hot and shameful. He finally looked up, meeting Elias's gaze. "What can I do?" he pleaded, his voice cracking. "How can I ever make it right?" Elias turned his gaze back to the lake, watching a ripple spread from where his last stone had landed. "You can't make it right. The past is stone. It can't be changed. You can only build a different future." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "Don't try to get your old life back. Don't try to be Dr. Alan Vance, the brilliant surgeon, ever again. That man was a failure. Build a new life, one based on listening instead of talking, on humility instead of pride, on seeing the person, not their status. You're stocking medical supplies? Then be the best damn stockist they've ever had. Make sure every nurse has what they need before they even ask. Learn their names. Ask them about their day. Start there. Start by being useful. Quietly. Humbly. That is the only apology that will ever mean anything." Vance stood there for a long moment, the cool mountain air washing over him. He had come seeking forgiveness, but Elias had given him something far more valuable: a path. A hard, unglamorous, difficult path toward becoming a man he could live with. He nodded slowly, a flicker of a new, hard-won purpose in his tired eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. He turned and walked away, his shoulders still slumped, but his step a fraction lighter. He left Elias Thorne by the water, a quiet hero in a quiet place, a man who had faced down death on the battlefield and arrogance in a hospital, and had conquered both with nothing more than the profound, unshakable integrity of his own two hands.